Hey, welcome back. The United States would become known by 1940 as the arsenal of democracy. We would make the weapons of little and mass destruction, which would defeat fascism abroad. Hard to believe that Detroit was also known as the arsenal of democracy. Try to imagine a time in which Detroit was so plentiful with industrial and military jobs that hundreds of thousands of Americans around the country were flocking to Detroit. Well, that was the early 1940s. How things change and how quickly they change, right? But what I want to talk about is not so much the kind of this military Keynesianism. We'll talk about that in a future lecture, but I really want to talk more about how World War I changed America on the home front. So we're not going to talk about World War II and its kind of European theater. You can watch Saving Private Ryan and all that stuff, but I'm really interested in how did war or America's involvement in war change the United States at home. We did that with World War I. How did World War I change the progressive movement? We need to see how World War II is generative of many of the pushes for civil rights that would become characteristic of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century. We see how World War II is generative of some of those. So we want to talk about how America changes on the home front, and specifically, I'm going to use, for lack of better terms, we're going to look at winners and losers on the American home front because of World War II. And it's not entirely the case that there are clear-cut winners and clear-cut losers, but that's what we're going to do. Our first group of winners are American women. America's place, or women's place in American life, had already been changing during the interwar years, changing during the Great Depression. I think I'd mentioned this before, but during the Depression, men were getting laid off and women were getting employed to replace them because the belief was you didn't have to pay women as much as you paid men. Their labor was not as important. So by 1940, 25% of the workforce already were women at that point. The U.S. entry into the war, the coming of the war, the need to build the arsenal of democracy, and a number of men signing up for the draft. About 16 million Americans, men and women, would sign up to serve in the armed forces. Created openings, but also a whole new number of jobs. Right? I think we talked about this in the New Deal lecture. Right? What brings America out of the Great Depression is not the New Deal, but it's spending on World War II. It's all these new jobs, and women certainly benefit from this explosion of new opportunities for employment. Between 1940 and 1945, an estimated 6 million new women would enter into the workforce. 2 million to civil service jobs, 4 million became that iconic symbol you've heard of before, Rosie the Riveter. Those women who became, whether it was welders or involved in some other manufacture of defense items, these women stepped up by the millions and became these crucial workers for helping us win the war and build the arsenal of democracy. Now, we saw during World War I that a similar thing happened. Economic gains or economic activity translated into political gains. Women entered into the workforce. They entered into the defense sectors during World War I. And as a reward, Woodrow Wilson supported the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote. After that time, the women's movement really kind of splintered between different groups. Here's kind of the dividing line for the women's movement after all the different women could agree that women should have a right to vote, but what do they do with the vote? What direction do they take their newfound political power afterwards? Women could not agree, and so some had stressed equality with men. In 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, which simply said men and women shall have equal rights. That was first brought up in 1923, mainly by Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, but it doesn't really go anywhere. There's not a lot of support in Congress, and there's just not a lot of support among the female population. For other feminist groups, they didn't want to stress equality. They wanted to stress women's particular status as women in the economy, and they wanted reforms or legislation that would protect women's unique status, particularly as caregivers, as mothers, as wives, and so treat women not as equal with men, but treat women as different than men, and let's have legislation that kind of protects women in the workforce. And so the women's movement kind of fractured on these two questions. Does World War II bring them together? And the answer ultimately is no, it does not. Based on the Rosie the Riveter, this unprecedented move of women into the workforce, and particularly into heavy industry, will not translate into a vibrant or unified women's movement coming out of the war. You won't see significant legislative gains as you saw during World War I. You had the Women's Bureau that continued to stress women's difference from men and wanted legislation that would protect women in the workforce, versus the National Women's Party, which is still there pushing the Equal Rights Amendment. In fact, Congress would take up the Equal Rights Amendment during the war. So it made a little bit of progress, but it only passed one house. And so it doesn't still make it out of Congress. The women's movement is still fractured. Eleanor Roosevelt would try to press her husband. And then after Roosevelt dies in 1945, press the new president, Harry Truman, to appoint more women to positions of, in cabinet and in government. And Truman will give a really nice speech on behalf of women in their service in World War II, but he will not appoint women to these positions. And so politically, the women's movement is not energized. It remains fractured during World War II. And instead, what you see after World War II is, in many ways, a repudiation of Rosie the Riveter, a call at many different sectors of American life to call women back into traditional roles. There was in 1946, the government is actively putting out propaganda, calling women to leave their jobs, give those jobs back to men returning from the home front, and women should retire and instead of Rosie the Riveters, become the old angels of the household. But this kind of pressure on women to conform to traditional stereotypes and to kind of forget the economic lives, freedoms that they had enjoyed during the war years. This is happening at all levels of society. So, for instance, a book was written by a female sociologist and psychologist in 1947, The Modern Woman, The Lost Sex. You can kind of guess that what this book is getting at. The woman, who wants to have a public life, the woman who wants to have a career, the woman who wants to not have kids or maybe not marry is lost, right? The 19th century had talked about women who wanted a more public role outside of marriage and child rearing were desexed. Now these women 100 years later are saying the modern woman is the lost sex. They say in this book any spinster should be barred by law from having anything to do with the rearing of children. So any female students listening to this, right? If you want to be educators, you better get married according to the parameters of this book, because if you're single, you shouldn't be raising kids, because that's something that only mothers and wives should be able to do. And if we fast forward and read, we'll talk eventually about Betty Friedan's the feminine mystique, but she did research into magazine advertisements and articles in the post-war years, and just the pressure on women to abandon any kind of public life and to think of them solely as domestic creatures, as mothers and as wives, was just enormous during these years. Friedan would call the 1950s home the comfortable concentration camp, where the society just refused to acknowledge that women could have any role outside of the home. So you might be wondering at this point, why do I put women in the winners category? um, if their Rosie the Riveter ended up being kind of short-lived, and it's because Rosie the Riveter wasn't short-lived. World War II opened up doors for female employment that never really were closed. The image was that women had stepped up to serve their country, but they dutifully went and retired to suburbia to be wives and mothers during the 1950s, to be the June cleavers. The reality was quite different. Yes, it's true. In 1946, that 3.5 million women left the workforce. And everyone was talking about Rosie's going home. Rosie's getting married. In that same year, 2.5 million women entered the workforce. Nobody's talking about that. By 1950, female employment a percentage of female employment in the workforce was equal to wartime years. No one's talking about that. And during the 1950s, the supposed June Cleaver years, the reality is, look, it's expensive to keep up with the Joneses. It's expensive to maintain those big houses out in Livonia. And so increasingly, dad came home from work and the woman went out to work. They had part-time work, in part because they wanted to, but in part because they needed to supplement husband's income. So the number of two-income households, the number of women working in the workforce just continued to grow during the 1950s. While the image remained June Cleaver, the woman who stays home and has, does all the cleaning and has the food ready for when Ward gets home and, is ready to is just the perfect mother taking care of the kids, right? The reality is that more and more women just did not fit that mold. You will get women's liberation in the 1960s and 1970s out of this massive cultural contradiction. That our culture is saying women are solely domestic creatures and caregiving creatures, when the reality was that women were so much more than that and wanted so much more than that. That is when you will have women's liberation. Friedan's book will just be kind of the spark plug saying, hey, let's call attention to the fact that we have this huge contradiction here. Women want more than just simply a domestic life, and yet our culture just says this is all that women can do. You see echoes of that already, though, during the war years. In 1947, the Congress of American Women, a communist-based labor union in the United States, by 1950 would have 250,000 members, so not an inconsequential labor movement for women. And the CAW would be recommending a lot of things that women, feminists in the 1960s and 1970s would be calling for. So, for instance, nationalized health care, federally funded daycare centers, minimum wage legislation. All these things that we come to characterize 60s and 70s, you have already during the war years, you already have some women embracing this, embracing these policies. So the appearance is that women made kind of short-term gains into the economy and then went home. And it is true that politically speaking, the women's movement remained fractured during and after World War II. But economically speaking, World War II opened up doors for female employment that never really were closed. Rosie never truly went home. And when the contradiction became too great between what women were actually doing and what they were told that they could do, that is when you have second wave feminism in the 60s and 70s. So in many ways, we need to understand the birth, if you will, of women's liberation of the 60s and 70s. We'll talk about that in a future lecture. We need to understand how that's rooted in many ways in changes that are a result of World War II. I'm putting African Americans into the winner category as well, too. You're used to thinking of the civil rights movement as something that happens in the 50s and 60s in the South and is led by Martin Luther King Jr. The reality is that the civil rights movement actually begins in the North during the 1940s. And it's broader, has broader aims than what will come. The civil rights movement begins in the Double V campaign of the 1940s. After the United States enters into the war, African Americans develop a Double V campaign as they call it, a double victory. What is this double victory? A victory over fascism abroad, but a victory over fascism at home. During the 1930s, several African Americans had begun thinking of Jim Crow, kind of like the Nazi ghetto policy in the 1930s. They started making those kinds of connections, and they were saying, look, if we call the Nazis fascists, then we need to call the Jim Crow system at home fascism as well. Why worry so much about fascism in Germany? We have fascism here in the United States in terms of our Jim Crow system, right? It's the same thing. It's the intending to deny economic and political and social rights to persons of color. This is exactly what Nazis were pursuing against the Jews in the 1930s. And I think I mentioned this. The Jews even looked to American segregation laws to justify their ghettoization policy of Jews in the 1930s. So African Americans are making this connection. So when the United States enters into a war against Germany and against fascism, African Americans said, we're going to help you defeat fascism abroad, but only because, understand, we want to defeat fascism at home. One 15-year-old summarized the Double V campaign this way. As we look to defend democracy against foreign attack, let's give fair play and free opportunity to all Americans at home. Maybe you've heard of this 15-year-old before, Martin Luther King Jr. Even as a teenager, right? Understand the king that you're used to of the I Have a Dream and all that stuff. He is educated. He is nurtured in the Double V campaign of older African Americans at that time. A Double V campaign that is based in places like Harlem and Chicago and Detroit. This is where the civil rights movement is growing in the Double V campaign. Eventually, it will go south, but it begins here as a response to World War II. Never let a crisis go to waste. African Americans are here with their Double V campaign saying, how, and really in an intelligent way, drawing upon the myth and reality of America, how America wants to be understood in the world. Right? America wants to be understood as the arsenal of democracy. We're helping the democratic nations around the world. We're producing to defend them. African Americans are saying, how can we be the leaders of democracy? How can we be the defenders of democracy abroad when we don't practice democracy at home? How can we call ourselves the arsenal of democracy when we won't give employment to persons of color, when we won't provide housing, or we deny housing to persons of color? How can the United States effectively present itself as a democratic nation defending the democratic rights of other countries when we continue to practice Jim Crow at home? And we'll see from the 40s all the way into the 1960s that African Americans will be playing upon America's international reputation in order to advance civil rights. Right? In other words, the civil rights movement advances in an international context. Without America's involvement in these wars and eventually the Cold War, there just would not have been a lot of pressure on Washington, on the federal government, to make changes to our racial order. But we'll see as we go through this lecture and future lectures that that's exactly what's happening. The Double V campaign just suggests that African Americans were done trying to make separate but equal work. I mean, since the foundation of the NAACP in 1909, that's largely what African American reformers had targeted. Let's make separate but equal work. So you say you want separate but equal. Okay, so give adequate funding to black schools. But they accepted that logic of separate but equal. The Double V campaign is when African Americans said we can't make separate but equal work. It doesn't work. It's inherently unequal. And so, as you can see from the picture there, the Double V campaign was, we're going to defeat fascism abroad, but we're putting Jim Crow to death here at home. We're done with Jim Crow. And you just see a greater militancy on the part of African Americans Uh, it's not seen as much in the military, and it's just because the United, as Gerstle will talk about, we fight World War II. We fight fascism, and we fight the Japanese in the Pacific with a segregated military. Um, the armed forces won't be desegregated until 1948. So Jim Crow is in the U.S. military, even while we're trying to defeat democracy abroad. You see this more militancy at home, and you see it among Northern African Americans. So, a few examples of the Double V campaign. Philip Randolph is a veteran African American labor organizer. Uh, Not sure which city he's based in, whether it was New York or Chicago, but as the United States enters into the war, as African Americans are looking to move into places like Detroit for defense jobs, as they are denied even a chance to interview for those jobs, Randolph is seeing this take place, and he said, "We've got to do something about this." So Randolph calls in 1940. Randolph calls up the president of the United States, FDR, says, "Hey, just want you to know that you're talking about America as the arsenal of democracy, and yet African Americans are not allowed to serve their country openly in the armed forces. You have a segregated military, and African Americans are not allowed to work in defense industries at home. They're being denied these opportunities to serve their country. So, FDR, I want you to know, I and a million of my friends are going to march in Washington, D.C. under protesting of these conditions." And FDR is like, "Oh, oh, so you want, okay, so, all right, I see what you're getting at." Now, ultimately, the march in Washington never happens. Randolph will call it off. He threatened it, but he didn't get everything he wanted from FDR, but he got enough to call off the march. So the march doesn't actually take place, but he threatens it. I mean, think what a PR disaster that would have been. Right, here, the United States is trying to say we're the defenders of democracy against the totalitarianism of fascism in Japan. And here's a million people marching on Washington, D.C. to say, no, we're no better than the Nazis. We're no better than Japan. We have exactly the same kind of authoritarian rule here. Would have been a terrible PR disaster. And so Roosevelt convinces Randolph to call it off. He doesn't desegregate the armed forces. We fight all of World War II. I mean, increasingly, some African Americans are allowed to join in, but for the most part, we fight World War II with a segregated military. Where Randolph does get a concession is in the middle of 1941. Roosevelt will sign the Fair Employment Practices Commission, the nation's first FEPC, into being. The FEPC is kind of just what it sounds like. It's a government agency whose responsibility is making sure that corporations are engaging in fair employment practices. It's the first of its kind. This is an agency specifically targeting race and racial discrimination in defense industries. And so the FEPC had the power to investigate, to find, and to possibly shut down a corporation which was engaging in racially discriminatory hiring or firing practices. Now, here's the important thing to understand. The FEPC, how does it know who and when to investigate? Well, this goes back to the new militancy of African Americans. When African Americans went to work at a particular factory or particular industry and they couldn't get even an interview, they protested. They visibly called attention to what was going on there. And then the government said, "Oh, I guess we need to go and investigate." And the government went in and investigated and found out if there was or wasn't racial discrimination taking place there. But my point is this. The United States doesn't make advances in civil rights because white people suddenly just got over their racism, or the federal government just suddenly decided to do right by persons of color. It's African Americans again and again and again forcing the issue, leveraging, in this case, America's international reputation to bring about these changes. Right, we get an FEPC not because Roosevelt was particularly feeling generous towards persons of color. We get it because of the activity of people like Randolph. The FEPC does its job because African Americans were willing to protest and to call attention to discriminatory practices. So it's the new militancy and aggressiveness in African Americans in fighting for their civil rights. And this is beginning in the North, not in the South. It's beginning among Northern African Americans as a result of the great migrations that we've talked about in here. That's bringing on this advance in civil rights. Now, the armed forces are not desegregated during World War II. They will be in 1948. Truman just feeling generous that day? No, it's A. Philip Randolph again. He had formed a group a year before, the League for Nonviolent Civil Disobedience. They engaged in protest against the U.S. government. This was, the United States is starting to transition into a war against communism. How can the United States present itself as the leader of the free world while it continues to discriminate against persons of color at home? It can't, right? That's a terrible hypocrisy on America's part. And Randolph and the WWIIs are just, they exploit that for civil rights advances. And so, feeling pressure from Randolph and the League for Nonviolent Civil Disobedience, Truman will desegregate the military in 1948. And notice that phrase, nonviolent civil disobedience, right? Where have you heard that before, right? Something that we associate, again, with the 50s and 60s and with MLK. We think that like MLK like started or created nonviolent civil disobedience. No, he just came to symbolize it later on, but he's really second, even possibly third generation of African Americans who are using this kind of peaceful protest practice, right? It's people like Randolph in the North who are pioneering these techniques that people like King later on would come to embrace these kinds of strategies. So again, all the things we associate nonviolent civil disobedience or nonviolent direct action campaigns that we associate with the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, you need to understand that's happening here in World War II, but it's happening in the North before King is, even on the scene. The NAACP, been around since 1909, but World War II, it would increase its membership ninefold to 450,000 members. This gives it a lot of money. It gives it a prestige and a new confidence. The NAACP will go after discriminatory American laws and practices, culminating probably in 1954 with the NAACP suit that would become the Brown versus Board of Education decision. We'll talk about that in a future lecture. The Congress on Racial Equality in 1944 is begun. Why should you pay attention to CORE? In 1960, groups of African American and white college students would engage in freedom rides around the South, riding Greyhounds and trying to desegregate America's busing system. That was CORE. That was CORE who was sponsoring that move. So even some of the key civil rights organizations of the later 50s and 60s are getting their start here and beginning to practice direct action, nonviolent direct action. They're practicing that already here during the war years. One final story I'll tell you is the story of the Sojourner Truth Public Housing Project in Detroit. As Southerners, by the tens, even hundreds of thousands, are moving into Detroit, they don't just need jobs, but they need housing. Who's going to house all these African Americans who's going to house all these people coming in? The Sojourner Truth, the public housing project, the federal government is building public housing to house these migrants coming in to work in defense industries. The problem is, as you can see there, Detroiters, they didn't want persons of color as their neighbors. They're trying to keep up a kind of white racial utopia in Detroit, and they're really upset about this influx of African Americans coming into Detroit. And so they're pressuring the people creating the public housing project to deny admission to African Americans. And it kind of goes back and forth. The Sojourner Truth people, obviously it's named Sojourner Truth for one of the African American abolitionists during the Civil War years. Initially this is a project for African Americans. Under pressure from Detroit, they change. It's like, okay, this is going to be a white project, and then kind of at the last minute they go back to, it's like, no, this is going to be for African Americans. And the only thing that's happened is that everybody gets really, really upset. So it's February of 1942. 14 families go to move into Sojourner Truth. And they are confronted, they have 300 people on their side helping them, but they're confronted by 700 white neighbors around Sojourner Truth who are going to deny admittance for these 14 families. And a riot breaks out. 200, about 230 people will be arrested. 223 of them were African American. So you can kind of see the decks are really stacked against African Americans being able to make to improve their economic and social conditions. Here they are; they've made the move from the South. They're simply wanting to move into this housing project that the federal government has set up. The government's doing this for all kinds of workers coming in. They simply just want to exercise this right to adequate housing. And white Detroit is not having any of it, and the police force ultimately is coming in on the side of white Detroit. But these are the double V years, as one of the family members says. The government's about to take me to fight for democracy abroad. I'd just as soon fight for democracy right here. This ability to move into this Sojourner Truth housing project was part of the fight for democracy during these years. African Americans were not just fighting to defend democracy abroad against the Nazis or the Japanese. They were fighting for democracy at home against the fascists in their own society, which denied basic rights to persons just because of the color of their skin. Now, to their credit, about 3 months later, the Sojourner Truth public housing project developers, they say, no, this is going to be for African Americans. And so a few months after this incident, those 14 families, with the protection of about 1,600 national state militia and police, these 14 families are able to move in to Sojourner Truth. Eventually, about 140 families would be living in the housing project. So the persistence of African Americans does pay off in terms of them being able to increase socio and economic rights as a consequence of World War II. Sojourner Truth is, though, telling in that as African Americans are moving north, that Northerners are going to start acting exactly like white Southerners in resisting integration. Northerners didn't want African Americans as neighbors, as fellow sitting next to them in pew, their kids going to school. And you see white supremacy is just as rooted in the North as it is in the South during these years. And it shouldn't surprise us that most major American cities in 1943 and 1944 experienced race riots. As African Americans are pressing their claims to their basic democratic rights, as white people are resisting, trying to uphold the racial, discriminatory racial order of Jim Crow, America will experience some pretty intense racial violence in places like Detroit. You can go to the Detroit Historical Museum, see a wonderful display about the 1943 riots, and the 1967 riots there in Detroit, and get some of this history there. You can go for free. It's a free museum, so go check it out. And so, we should say one of the consequences of the Double V campaign is increased racial violence in the United States. But if the only way in which justice can be brought about is through risking social disorder, racial disorder, don't you have to see that through? Maybe that's something we need to talk about in class. But just understand that what we call the civil rights of the 50s and 60s is actually beginning here in the Double V campaign in 1941. For a while, historians called this the long civil rights movement. Now historians are pretty much saying it's just a civil rights movement. We had to decenter the Southern experience. We have to decenter King's experience, and we really have to say the civil rights movement is beginning here in the Double V campaign in northern cities in World War II. So while they face all kinds of setbacks along the way, I would say that the Double V campaign marks the beginnings of significant gains in civil rights for African Americans during and after World War II. There were losers from World War II. I don't know that anyone lost more than Japanese Americans. The Japanese had been migrating to the United States until they couldn't. They had to stop in 1907 by an agreement Roosevelt made with the Japanese government. But before then, Japanese had been coming in to the United States and had established themselves on the West Coast as pretty successful independent businessmen. You know, like grocery stores and other businesses. There was it was a very hardworking, integral, and successful community. In a community that was always resented or disliked by their white neighbors. When Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, it shouldn't surprise us that West Coasters, and the U.S. government feared this too, right? There's all kinds of military presence moved out to the West Coast. They feel like an invasion from Japan is coming to the United States in the near future. And so Westerners are freaking out. The military is freaked out in all kinds of ways. And one of the problems they identify is a large presence of Japanese Americans on the West Coast, which they feel, which they worried were a security risk. What if these Japanese are part of the invasion? What if they're helping to plan the invasion? You know, they're just considered a subversive element. So in roughly the same years that Roosevelt, actually the same month, I think, February 1942, in which Roosevelt signs in the Fair Employment Practices Commission that's going to benefit African Americans, he's making the decision to create the War Relocation Authority. The War Relocation Authority would take, in its design, it was supposed to be Italians and Germans in the United States too, but it's going to be mainly Japanese. Over the course of 1940, over the course of 42, 43, 44, roughly 100,000 Japanese Americans would be taken from their homes and moved to 10 relocation centers around the United States. A lot of for instance, in Arkansas, where I used to live, there were 2 relocation centers there. The government just took over Native American land and put these relocation centers on them. Understand, I use this term Japanese American deliberately. The United States was placing U.S. citizens in concentration. Oh, sorry. Not supposed to call them concentration camps. That's what other countries do. They're relocation centers. Japanese Americans were being relocated to these there I go again. Relocation centers. It was American citizens. Roughly 2/3 of the 100,000 who were relocated to these centers were Nisei Japanese, second generation, meaning they were born on U.S. soil. If you're born on U.S. soil, what does that mean? You're a U.S. citizen and you should be entitled to all of the rights of any other citizen, right? Not so in this particular case. The Nisei are relocated along with other Japanese immigrants into the country who were not born here. They're all placed in these relocation centers. The Supreme Court would twice in 44 and 45 hear cases saying it's unconstitutional to put American citizens into these relocation centers. There I go again. I'll put them in these relocation centers. In both cases, the Supreme Court says, well, in a time of war, a president has more powers than they would otherwise, and so it's okay to place American citizens in concentration camps. Let's call them what they are. The guy who oversaw this relocation on the West Coast, a military commander, said, "A Jap is a Jap. It doesn't matter if they're an American citizen or not." I think as a country, we've gotten better about respecting civil liberties. than we were in the past, but it's good for us to remember some of the more egregious violations of the civil liberties of American citizens. And this was a pretty significant violation of those rights. American citizens were placed in relocation centers, certainly without their consent. Right, they had to do this. One of the interesting things is that the U.S. military, after Japanese Americans were placed in these camps, the U.S. government went around to these camps and started taking young Japanese boys out of these camps to go fight in the U.S. Army. They created an all-Japanese unit, the 442nd, which were all kids taken out of these concentration camps. Like here, like we're supposedly, the Japanese are security risks, and so we're moving them from their homes and businesses and putting them in concentration camps. Yet somehow we think that they can fight for the United States, and ultimately they do. One of the reasons I mentioned the 442nd is it's the most decorated military unit in American history, or at least it was when I started delivering these lectures. You can fact check me on that. But these were young men fighting for the United States when their parents were living in concentration camps. Why do I put Japanese Americans in the losers category? It's not just for what they lost in terms of their personal freedoms for a few years. Look, it's not like these 100,000 people were placed in camps for a couple of years, and then they went back to their homes and went back to their businesses. Look, this relocation was the destruction of a way of life. People who were forced to sell their homes or their businesses at fractions of a cost. I read one girl who talks about her father. Her father had $100,000 a year business. Before he was relocated, he sold it for $1 to at least get something out of this loss. Those who didn't sell their homes or their businesses just lost everything. This was the destruction of a way of life. In fact, 8,000 persons after they left the camps, they moved to Japan. Not that Japan was a great place to be looking for jobs and new opportunities after World War II, but they couldn't make it here in the United States anymore. Their way of life was destroyed. No one lost more in World War II than did Japanese Americans who were relocated against their will, and their businesses, their homes, their property was confiscated or destroyed. The government would not respond to this situation until, I believe, the 1980s, when an attempt was made to find the survivors of these camps and give them some compensation. But make no mistake, this was the destruction of a way of life. This was a kind of kinder, gentler genocide. I'm placing gay Americans, gay and lesbian Americans in the losers category as well too, although we can see an extent to which the gay civil rights movement is in some ways beginning during World War II. We're used to thinking of the gay civil rights movement as beginning in 1969 with the Stonewall riots, where gay and lesbian frequenters of the Stonewall Club had regularly been abused by police who raided the club. At Stonewall in 1969 is when they stopped, and out of Stonewall grew up a more vibrant and visible civil rights movement for gay and lesbian Americans. But you can see traces of that march towards civil rights coming out of World War II. There were gay and lesbians in America before your lifetime, right? There have always been gay and lesbian Americans in the United States. And there was no rules saying that they couldn't serve in the armed forces. When I started teaching this lecture, it was still illegal for gay and lesbian Americans to serve openly in the armed forces. So we're in a very different place now in your lifetime than say in mine. But even before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there was a policy of exclusion, but it's not there before World War II. It will be a consequence of World War II. Before World War II, as I said, about 16 million Americans signed up. A good percentage, we don't have exact numbers, but a good percentage, or what, a noticeable percentage, should I say. Some have theorized as much as 10%, so 1.6 million. People who served in the armed forces during World War II were gay and lesbian. And there was no law saying that they couldn't. There was a law going back to Revolutionary War days, an anti-sodomy law. If you were caught engaging in illicit sex, you could be discharged from the armed forces. Goes back to 1977 or 1777. And state law didn't target individuals either; it targeted behavior. Most states had anti-sodomy laws. If you were caught engaging in illicit gay sex, then you could be prosecuted under this law. But the idea that you would ban or convict somebody for being something like being gay, being lesbian, just that idea was pretty foreign to American law. And so gays and lesbians, they served in the armed forces. Until psychologists started going to military recruiters and saying, look, we've noticed that you're probably passing through some gay and lesbian Americans. Just know that there's something wrong with these people, right? They're not normal. They're queer, right? And you should probably do something to try to root them out. You should probably figure out how to, in the same way you wouldn't want somebody with flat feet, serving in the armed forces. You probably want to make sure that gay and lesbians aren't getting through. And so it was weird. Honestly, I've seen some video of this. Recruiters started asking people coming through the drafts. They would ask male recruits, for instance, do you like men? That was a question that was added. Some men were getting asked, do you like men? And I guess if you hesitated or said, yeah, I don't know. It was so weird, but this was how they, first tried to address the issue of gays and lesbians serving in the military. It's after World War II, and part of the fight on communism, that the military takes more aggressive policies to root out gay and lesbian troops. Project M46 takes over a policy that was part of the U.S. Navy. In August of 1949, Project M46 becomes all military policy. And you can have all military policy now. The National Security Act of 1947 created the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense can now make policy for all of the armed forces in the United States. And one of the first policies that they engage in is Project M46. And Project M46 says all homosexual personnel, irrespective of sex, shall be immediately discharged and dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Armed Forces. Prompt separation. Project M46 signifies not just a change in American military policy, it signals a change as well in American social policy too, away from targeting behavior and targeting individuals. As I said, before, military law as well as state law targeted behavior. If you engaged in or were caught engaging in gay sex, you could be prosecuted or discharged. Now, this policy is begin targeting, and honestly, the historians who write in this, the U.S. government policy is actually creating a new category of Americans, the homosexual. Yes, as I said, there were gays and lesbians before this time, but we didn't, as a population, we didn't try to single them out as a particular identity. Starting after World War II, this is when we begin to do this. We begin to talk about this new problem in American life, the homosexual. And it's a category of American that's created through federal policy, right? And it begins here in the military. With Project M46, the U.S. government is now targeting individuals, irrespective of whether they do or do not engage in gay sex. The U.S. government is now targeting being, targeting identity. If you are homosexual, if you are gay, if you are lesbian, irrespective of what you do, future laws kind of clarifying Project M46 would talk about tendencies. If you have or display tendencies towards homosexuality, you should be discharged from the armed forces. There was a report in 1959, 1957, the Crittenden report, which specifically looked at kind of the basis for this. The basis for Project M46 was, well, gays and lesbians are not right in the head. And so they will crack under pressure. They can't handle the discipline. They can't handle the pressures of military life. And the Crittenden report actually did an investigation, and what it came back to say was just no evidence for that. There's no evidence that gays and lesbians don't serve their country, don't serve the armed forces, can't handle the pressures as well as any straight person. Nevertheless, the Crittenden report still says we should continue the policy. Good for morale or whatever. So without any basis, for the belief that gays and lesbians can't handle military pressure as well as anyone else, the U.S. military says we're not going to have these people. Right? Again, it's irrespective of behavior. It's these people. If you are dishonorably discharged, you lose your GI Bill benefits. Gerstle talks about the GI Bill, this massive Keynesian project to help U.S. armed services members coming home, helping them go to college, providing free college for them, providing low-interest loans for them. Recipients of the GI Bill they didn't have to work for a year. They got like a year income. They could just kind of run around the country if they wanted to. I mean, just a massive economic benefit for veterans. If you were dishonorably discharged under the parameters of M46, if you were Section 8'd, and Section 8 came to be known as, if you're Section 8'd in American society, people begin to think, well, it's because you're queer, you're gay, you're lesbian. And all kinds of other discriminations fell that way. But your immediate discrimination was you lost your GI Bill benefits. You didn't get to participate in this. Even though you served your country and possibly served your country very well, under M46, gay and lesbian Americans are dishonorably discharged. They're Section 8'd. They lose their GI Bill benefits. And that discrimination follows them then throughout their life. If you're Section 8'd, it's very hard. It was harder to find employment. So gays and lesbians in the 1950s found it harder to find employment. Several states during these years began passing sexual psychopath laws. There was a great fear of child sex abuse during these years. And several states used these new sex psychopath laws to target gays and lesbians. A number of innocent gay and lesbian Americans found themselves committed to insane asylums under these laws. Just, and as America, you'll be reading about the Red Scare. I understand in America during these years underwent a Pink Scare, in which Americans feared gay and lesbians as much as they did communists. Because if you're gay or lesbian, you had something to hide, and that made you susceptible to communist manipulation. So all kinds of pressures, beginning with the armed forces, then flow out to American society during the 1950s. As gay and lesbian Americans, they lost, and they lost a lot. Some of them lost their GI Bill benefits. Others of them lost opportunities or just found themselves living under increased suspicion and surveillance during these years. But I want to end on this point. This intensification of pressures against gay and lesbian Americans, this war on this new category of American, the homosexual, produces an almost immediate backlash. we begin to see the rise of our first gay civil rights organizations in the backlash to Project M46 and this intensification of pressure on gay and lesbian. This is what tends to happen, right? When you push against a population, a lot of times they push back, right? You produce a resistance, and that's what we see happening. Rather than gays and lesbians going further back into the closet, many of them become even bolder. And you see the rise of gay subcultures in the United States in the 1950s, not just in New York or California, but in the Midwest, in Kansas City, even in the heartland. You begin to see the emergence of a more increasingly visible presence of gay and lesbian Americans, as they're refusing this oppression that's coming from the federal government. And you see the rise of groups like the Mattachine Society, a gay civil rights organization, and the Daughters of Bilitis, a lesbian civil rights organization. They're beginning here in the midst of this attempted repression of gay and lesbian Americans. And through the 60s, up until Stonewall, you will have the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis, leading a push for gay civil rights and lesbian civil rights in the United States. You will see some of the, I'm sorry, I don't have my notes anymore, so I can't read some of these testimonies, but some of the testimonies of people who are fighting their dishonorable discharges. You see the echo, or you see the origins, you see the anticipations of a more aggressive gay civil rights movement that will come later after 1970. You already see stirrings of that all the way back in 1949 and 1950, as gay and lesbian Americans, they refuse to submit to this new coercion, and they begin resisting. So we put gay and lesbian Americans in the losers category because in the short run they did lose, right? They literally lost in terms of their military service and their GI Bill benefits. They lost in terms of an increasing coercion against them in America in the 1950s and 1960s. But in the long run, we can say that in the same way that we can root women's liberation in the civil rights movement in World War II, we can also see the gay civil rights movement longer term also rooting in the years right after World War II. So to kind of summarize, war is a transformative force. World wars are especially transformative forces, not just on a global order, but at home. U.S. participation in World War II has brings about substantial domestic changes. Some that were beneficial to Americans in the long run, others that of course, gravely hurt Americans. But we do need to understand that when we talk about war, we need to understand how wars change America and change America at home, and not just America's standing in the world. All right, we done.